The following is a special encore presentation of Blue Sky that originally dropped in October of 2023. From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to Blue Sky, where we share stories and insights to remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. I'm your host, Bill Burke. Today's Blue Sky guest, LaTosha Brown, has been described by more than one person as a force of nature. I was fortunate to meet her about a year ago, inspired to introduce myself after watching her give a speech in which she described the challenging work she does with an incredibly infectious sense of hope and optimism. LaTosha is an award-winning thought leader, institution builder, cultural activist, artist, and connector. She's the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, an initiative designed to boost Black voter registration and turnout, as well as increase power in marginalized communities. LaTosha is also the founder and co-anchor of a regional network called Southern Black Girls and Women's Consortium, which you'll learn more about in our conversation. In 2021, LaTosha Brown was named one of Glamour magazine's Women of the Year. She was also a 2020 Hauser Leader at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School and a 2020 Leader in Practice at the Kennedy School's Women and Public Policy Program. Also a 2020-2021 American Democracy Fellow at the Charles Warren Center, also at Harvard. She's been featured on ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, and PBS. Her op-eds have been showcased in the New York Times, Politico, and Essence. And if that weren't enough, as you're about to hear, LaTosha Brown is one heck of a singer. I hope you enjoy this conversation with LaTosha as much as I did. LaTosha Brown, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
I have been looking forward to this for a long time. I know you're busy, so I really appreciate you doing this with me. And before we get started, I've read you say that your mother said you could sing before you could talk. And so just so you know, the ground rules for the Blue Sky Podcast, both spoken word and singing is allowed. So if the mood ever strikes, please don't hold back.
Well, the first thing I did right was the day I started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on, hold on. Don't tempt me, Bill. Like singing.
You are making Blue Sky history. No one has ever tried to sing, let alone sang at that incredible quality level. So thank you for that. I feel better already. So I don't always start my interviews with people's upbringings, but for you, I think it's particularly important because you were born in, of all places, Selma, Alabama. You went to Selma High School. And I was wondering, you're arguably the birthplace of the voting rights, civil rights movement. Were you aware of that when you were growing up? Did you feel that history, or was it just something you took for granted?
I did. I was actually, because I want to clarify, I wasn't born in Selma. I was raised in Selma. I moved there. I was actually born in New Jersey, but my parents got a divorce at the age of 3, so I don't know anything but Alabama.
Right.
But Selma Selma was always special, was interesting. And some of my earlier formative years as a toddler and early in elementary school, I was in Mobile, Alabama. We would go to Selma to visit my family. And there was always something about that bridge. I didn't really realize the political or the civil rights history, but the bridge was always the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is the famous bridge that people know from the civil rights movement for Bloody Sunday and a lot of the clips. You know, I remember having a visceral reaction every time I saw the bridge. You know, not really knowing the full history of it, but there was something about it that felt like a bridge to eras. That once you were on one side of the bridge, once you crossed the bridge, it was as if you were going into another town or a different. It's really interesting, almost like a very self-contained town. And so, given that, my family also, while they weren't very, they were working class, regular folk. Many members of my family, in one way or the other, participated in civil rights work. For example, my mother was a very smart and gifted child. And at the age of 14, she was recruited by a very well known civil rights leader named John LaFleur, who was running the NAACP in Mobile, Alabama. And her parents, he went to her parents and asked if she could be a part of basically this group of students. He wanted to integrate test integration, and he wanted to integrate the high school. And so and she had a real strong family background, and she was very smart. And so she went through this battery of, I don't know if people know this, but they had to go through a battery of tests, not just academic, but also mental, to make sure that they could handle what they were taking on. And so as through that process in the next year or so, this was a young woman who was very pretty, very gifted, and very social. And so
Yeah.
she was at her black high school, which was an all black high school, where she was Miss, she was Miss Everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And taken out of that environment at the age of 15 and placed in at Murphy High School, which with 3,000 white students who did not want her to be there. Many of them,
Right.
most of them, did not want, in a very highly contentious, this is 1965,
Ooh.
a highly, 64 and 65, a highly contentious environment. And it was really, it had a remarkable impact on her life.
Sure.
Up until she died in 2016, it was a life-changing moment, to be surrounded in a space, to go from a space where you are loved and nurtured, to go into a space that you are hated and taunted every single day. I think we underestimate what kind of impact that has on. And she was a child. Because she graduated at 16. She started. She was she was very, very young, and gifted. And so, that was one of that was kind of some of the introduction in my family around civil rights for me, because it was they were really proud of her. They were really
Sure.
proud of her. She was actually that particular. She and Bertie Mae Davis. There's a case. It is a case that actually integrated high schools in the state of Alabama, and my mother was a part of that. And so it was she, along with two other young women. The other young woman named Bertie Mae Davis, who graduated with her, and then her younger sister Betty Davis was a year under them. So three African American children, in an environment that was extremely contentious. And quite frankly, people were very, very mean to her. She said there were some
Yeah.
people who were nice, but very mean. So I had that kind of orientation of hearing that. And then I had some family members. My oldest aunt, my mother was the baby, but her oldest sister was actually a part of the Bloody Sunday. She was there on Bloody
Wow.
Sunday. She was in Selma, and my father was a part of the group in Macomb, Mississippi, that integrated schools. So because of their growing up and the era in which they grew up and they came into being as teenagers and young adults, I was actually surrounded by these stories of people close to me that were part of these civil rights kind of integration efforts, but and also this really, really amazing history. And so
Yeah.
as I learned the history of Selma, I had the opportunity as a young woman to meet many of the people who had been actively a part of the leadership in the civil rights movement. And several of them became mentors of mine, like Reverend C.T. Vivian
Sure.
was a mentor of mine who was absolutely one of the most gifted people I've ever met in my life.
Incredible.
He was
Yeah.
incredible. I think he's nothing short but from an angel, who died in 2017, a few years ago. I also had the opportunity to meet John Lewis. I had the opportunity to be mentored by Reverend James Orange, who
Mm.
was one of the close lieutenants with Dr. King, and Bernard Lafayette, and got to meet Diane Nash. And those are people who were actually the inner circle of Dr. King, and several of them became mentors of mine. So I'm extremely, extremely grateful. And I believe part of it was because I was in Selma. I had access to them. They would come every year for the commemoration of Bloody Sunday, and I ran a youth group, and we'd do work together. So
Amazing.
growing up, on some level, I knew something spectacular had happened there, and I knew my people had been a part of that. But the fullness of the history, I really got it as a young adult when I started working and being mentored and poured into those who were actually the leadership in the civil rights movement.
First off, I told you she could sing. And it's easy to see how growing up in Selma played a huge role in LaTosha's life. And the depth of that impact is evident when she says, "There's something about the Edmund Pettus Bridge." And once again, we have a blue sky guest who was raised by a remarkable single mom, who went through so much as a teenager, integrating a large public school in the 1960s. We tend to think of desegregation being over and done with in the 50s, but as the story of LaTosha's mom illustrates, it took a lot longer than that. And here I'll state my belief that it's important and helpful for people in our country to study all of our history, not just the parts that make us proud. Understanding how tough things were for so many in LaTosha's mom's generation can help us appreciate the progress we've made in the years since, and also give us hope that if we keep working on our tough challenges around race, we can continue to make strides. Getting back to our conversation, after talking about her mom and mentioning an aunt who was there on Bloody Sunday, I wanted LaTosha to also speak about the impact that her grandparents had on her upbringing. So much of your work now is around voting rights, and if my research is right, you also were fairly close to your grandparents, and they would talk. Your grandmother would take you into the polls with her, and I think you also described your grandfather kept his voting card in his wallet and would show it to you. And I think so many of us take voting for granted. Although I can remember, my parents used to take me when I was a little kid too, and I'd watch them pull those old levers. It seems like they had a big influence on you as well, and probably had a lot to do with your current work.
Oh, absolutely. My grandparents were really just solid, good, amazing people, working class folks. My grandmother was born in 1910, and my grandfather was born in 1905. And so, and they were born in, they were, they lived the majority of their life, their entire life in Alabama and in the Black Belt, which was very contentious, a contentious environment. And it's interesting because my grandfather had a very interesting life because he had a white father and a Black mother who lived together as a couple, as a married couple.
Wow.
This is in the late 1800s. Right,
Wow.
which was pretty remarkable and amazing, just as a feat in itself. But because he was a major landowner, they were protected in many ways. But he was also he warned them. He was very, very protective of his kids. He was very clear about the community surrounding them and how it would treat his Black children. And so my grandfather had a unique kind of understanding of that. But the majority of his life, he was unable to vote. Here is a man who was a hard worker, who took care of his family. The vast majority of his life, neither he or my grandmother were able to vote. And so once they moved from what they called down the country up to Mobile, I guess, which was the city, they were, and as a result of the civil rights and the voting rights movement, they were first to make sure that they were registered to vote, and they were very, very proud of it. I didn't have an understanding of it because this is like the early 70s, it's early and mid 70s, but I knew something was special. Because my grandmother would always, before we would go to vote, she would take me to vote with her, and she would put on her Sunday clothes, and she had certain purses. She called her purses a pocketbook. And she had a pocketbook that we knew was the special pocketbook that you take to church or you take to a funeral or a wedding. It was the good purse, right? And so she had the ship rope. And before we would go vote, she wanted to take her good pocketbook. So she was go get her good pocketbook. So you knew it was special then. And we would go off to go vote, which wasn't that far from our house. Matter of fact, it was a store not too far from my house where they would set up these booths. And it was kind of interesting because I always thought the booths as a kid was kind of cool anyway, because it was this curtain. Like, so you would go into the booths and,
Ah,
you pull the curtain. My
exactly.
grandmother would sign and you pull the curtain back and I would go in there. But there were two things that I would note. Like once I was in there was interesting because it was just like my grandmother and I in the booth, and she would show me and let me help pull the lever for her. But then she would walk out the booth. It was something about the way she walked out of the booth that made a difference to me. It was almost like she walked out a little taller. Like she would go in the booth. She didn't need help from my grandmother didn't drive. So my grandmother, while she literally,
Ah,
I would say she directed the household from her chair in the house, in many ways, she was very dependent on others to help like drive her and take her. It was kind of in that moment. There was something about that moment that I saw her agency, as a person that she didn't need my
yep.
grandfather. She was making a decision. She was doing something and alone for that she wanted to do. And so it was something about that voting process. And then we would walk out and she would pull the curtain back and she would put her pocketbook under one arm and then have my hand. And we would both walk out like we had just went and had tea with the queen, and so there was something that
Ah,
had that had an impact on me because I knew in that process that we had just done something that was special, that was good. I don't actually remember her ever sitting down to me talking about how important it was of voting. It was almost like it was a given in my family. Like when you get 18, you're gonna register to
right.
vote. And so it was something really special. And even for my grandfather had he had a poll tax where he had paid a poll tax receipt where it gave him the right to be able to vote. And he just he well, it didn't give him the right. It was something that actually allowed him, paying that fee allowed him to be able to
Right.
vote. And he had it folded up in his wallet and he kept it. And so just the fact, and it was so beat up and bent up and worn around the edges. But the fact that he kept it and folded up and kept it in his wallet, I knew it was something special. So yes, from a child, I knew that there was something that my family held as a value around voting that literally I think did lay the foundation for me to understand. Like it was unconscionable for me. Like I couldn't wait until I get 18 to vote. Like it was unconscionable for me to think about
Right.
not voting. Like why would I not want to vote? I want to be able to vote and make decisions. And so there was something in my family that actually supported that culture. And like I said, I don't even remember ever having. I think maybe it was so integrated in what we did that I don't remember having some remarkable conversation about it.
Amazing. And you also, from an early age, took a probably unusual interest in leadership. And you've described you'd walk into a space, a business, a store, a school, and you'd always want to know who's the leader, who's in charge.
I
Where do you think
would.
that came from?
I that's from a little kid. It's like a running joke in my family. I always was fascinated. Now I'm able to label it. I couldn't label it when I was younger. But I've always been fascinated with power, who had power and how we use
Mm.
power. And so even as a small
Hmm.
kid, I would go with my grandmother and we would go in stores. Everywhere we would go, I would ask her, because I called her mama. I was like, Mama, who owns this? And she would be so baffled. It didn't matter if we went in a church, if we went into a ice cream shop, if we went into Kmart. I wanted to know. I was like, Mama, who owns this? And she would look at me. She's like, baby, I don't know who owns this. Like, why are you asking me? She's like, baby, I don't know who owns this. This Kmart. And I'm like, yeah, I know it's Kmart. But in my mind, I'm like, somebody owns Kmart. Like, I hear what you're saying, but I want to know who owns Kmart, right? And so over the years, it was something I was always fascinated with. And I think I know why. I started to put two and two together. That was one element of like really always wanting to know who was in charge, who could make decisions. I wanted to know who could make decisions to make things happen, right? And I literally
Right.
remember that from as early as 5 years old. I don't remember ever not wanting to know who's in charge. And then the second thing is I always had this really strong feeling towards justice. And, I didn't have the language to
Yes.
call it that, but I knew that. So I couldn't stand to see people be bullied. There was something about that that would make me so
Yeah.
upset that I would move out of myself. And so I remember early on, being a child and a little bitty skinny girl, and the big boys were picking on a little boy, and I jumped in the fight. And the only concern I had, I talk about this, and this is probably part of my shoe fetish. The only concern I had was that I had these pretty white patent leather shoes that my grandmother bought me for Easter. And you can scuff the white patent leather. And the only hesitation I had was, darn, I'm gonna have to scuff my shoes up if we fight. Right. And so, but I jumped in and was like, no, and literally jumped in front of them, hitting this little boy. And I don't know if they were just amazed at my courage or just thought that I was like a crazy little skinny girl, because there's no way I would have been able to fight those big boys. But I would have tried, but there was something in that it stopped it. It stopped that moment from happening. And I think there are other times I never understood how people could see folks abuse power and not do anything about it. So, as I've gotten older, I think those two things come out of the same. I think they come out the same kind of interest of mine. I've always been interested in power. Like,
Yes.
who has power? Who has the power to change? And how are people using that power? When people are abusive with that power, when people are using that power to torture other people, I've always felt a really, really strong desire that as human beings, we could stop that. We could do something about it.
Back to the subject of studying all of our country's history. Given the laws in place back then, one might assume that LaTosha's grandparents were able to vote, but they were systematically denied that right until they moved out of rural Alabama to the city of Mobile. And it's a beautiful story she tells about her grandmother dressing up to vote and walking out of the booth so proudly. And hearing this story should be a reminder to all of us not to take for granted our right to vote. And how great is the image of the young LaTosha getting ready to take on the bullies in her patent leather shoes. Getting back to our conversation, after explaining her early fascination with power, I wanted LaTosha to talk about running for office herself. When you were old enough to start getting into positions of power, at one point you ran for office. You ran for the Alabama House in, I think, 2002, and had a painfully close election that you lost in a runoff. And I don't know if you ever ran for office again after that, but I'd love to know your thought process in terms of how could you, LaTosha Brown, make the biggest impact? Could it be, because I'm sure you could have won if you stayed at it, but instead it seems you chose to work in different ways. What has led you to not continue to try to hold office, but instead get involved in voting rights and that sort of thing?
Oh, Bill, that's the first time I've been asked that question that way. That's an excellent question. Thank you for asking. When I ran, I think sometimes people seek office for different reasons. And unfortunately, I think there are too many people that are seeking office because they want position.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
it may or may not be anything wrong with wanting position, but that the driver is positioning. My interest in running for office wasn't about me capturing the position. I wanted power. I wanted power to be able to impact. And
Right.
so if in my mind when I ran at the time, where I thought I could have the best impact around moving resources and also being able to impact and influence public policy, was being a policymaker, right?
Right.
And so within that context, when I ran for office, which was really interesting, it was it's an interesting story because it was one of the first times in my life that I experienced sexism, blatant sexism, even within my own community. I think
Hmm.
I had experienced it before in subtle ways, but as I ran for office this time, and I ran against a man, I grew up in the church. As I went around the South, as I went around in Alabama campaigning, that it was blatant in terms of I would not be allowed to speak from the diocese because I was a woman. That's what I was told.
Right.
So that my male counterpart could speak from the diocese, but I couldn't.
Oh my
Right. And
gosh.
so I couldn't understand that. I was like, well, how can I just couldn't understand that. That was hard to process. But then I think that actually helped shape some of my beliefs and some of my work around women's empowerment as well. But I also, instead of allowing that, I did run. I ran several times. Ran a total of 3 times for public office, one for a state board of education, and then for the House seat. But what was interesting is that I learned the second time to instead let gender be weaponized against me, that I would embrace it and that I would actually use it. And so the second time that I ran, I intentionally decided that I was going to be as so if you had a problem with a woman, you gonna see me coming. So I literally, my campaign colors were hot pink and brown. I had the most vibrant pink you could find. I had hot pink and brown so that people could remember my last name, Brown. I was like, they'll remember the brown girl, Brown.
Nice.
And so I had everybody, and I embraced my gender and femininity. And I
Right.
actually utilized, my slogan was, the best place for a woman is in the house. Right. And since I was running for a
Nice.
House seat, I was like, you're right. The best place for a woman is in the house. Right. And so I would put on hot pink I would put on hot pink suits, skirt suits, and I had a chair with big pink flowers, and I called it the hot seat. And I would literally go into the most male-centered environments. I would go to the pool halls. I would go to the barber shops, and literally in my hot pink suit and high heels, I would sit in the middle of the barber shop and say, "All right, fellas, what you got for me? Come on with it." And literally, I would talk about my campaign, but other than that, I would let's engage in a conversation, and we would
Right.
talk about policy. It was the most interesting, fascinating, because what it felt like in many ways, like it would turn into a community debate. And sometimes our lovely men who had decided that I want to debate the woman. I was like, come on, what you
Let's
got?
go.
Let's go. And so it was so fascinating. It was a fascinating experience because I went in the lion's den. I went into
Yeah.
spaces that were very, very male centered, and taken, and I didn't leave any part of me. I would take my who I am, the fullness who I am as a woman. I would take my thoughts, and I would go in a way that wasn't combative. I was going in a way that said, this is silly. This whole notion of who can serve based on gender, this is pretty silly, right? Like, who you want to fight for me? You want him to fight for me or you? And it was interesting because I remember one particular incident where the barbers in the shop said, "We want you." And I was like, there you go. Good
Let's
answer.
go.
So let's go. So my point is, part of my interest was running for office was to actually, I wanted to make impact. And so
Yeah.
after those times that I ran for office, it wound up being in all of my races. I guess I can't, all of my races, it was razor thin. And one of them, I actually have a ruling in the Alabama Supreme Court, because that race, quite frankly, was just taken from me. There were 800 ballots that were voted that were not counted. That the sheriff conveniently forgot until 30 minutes after the race was certified, and so those were all thrown out in a county that I had carried overwhelmingly. So, so even given all of those things, I think they were all part of the shaping. And so, as a person who wants to make impact and change, I kind of start thinking to myself, if I want to make impact and change, what's the best way? What's the best vehicle? So instead of getting caught up in, I need a position, my focus has been since that time, in the last 15, 20 years, has been, the right position is not necessarily having the title. The right position is being where I can make the most impact and I can be most
Right.
effective. And so I have found that creating, working and focusing on the infrastructure, creating and organizing ecosystem and infrastructure and an organization that would actually put resources on the ground for other organizers that could expand our footprint, that I have found that has been, I think that's a more impactful way. I could not have seen it at the time, but
Right.
I think that was a far more impactful and effective way of accomplishing what I wanted to accomplish, which is to help shape public policy, to help move resources on the ground, and to actually help put a vision that people would see themselves differently as it relates to power.
It's interesting to hear LaTosha say that it wasn't until she ran for office that she experienced overt sexism. After being raised by so many strong women, this took her by surprise. And in her typical optimistic fashion, LaTosha faced this challenge head-on. I love the way she embraced being a woman and even emphasized it in her campaign. And her chosen campaign colors showed her knack for marketing: pink for female and brown for her last name. A resilient spirit helped LaTosha see these defeats as all part of her shaping, and also to realize that she could potentially have an even bigger impact without holding public office. To talk about that impact, I wanted to shift the conversation to LaTosha's current work. So the organization you wind up founding is Black Voters Matter, and it has had a huge impact. And I think one of the things you were able to do with that is it's not just in Alabama. If you'd run for the Alabama House, you're working on state issues. Now you're in many states. You're in key states for federal elections, state elections. And there's a quote that I had not heard this one from Dr. Martin Luther King that is described on your website as your goal with Black Voters Matter, when he said, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love."
That's right.
Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. That is the entire foundational basis of the founding of our organization. Cliff Albright and I, literally that quote in itself was the foundational basis for us creating Black Voters Matter. If you see anything that we ever do, you ever see our Black Voters Matter bus that we travel around the country, it will always have two words on there: love and power. Because we believe, like Dr. King, that there was a symbiotic relationship between love and power. And that we believe that in many ways, folks believe that you have to give up one, that you have to give up the love of humanity to have power, right? Or that you actually, at the expense of having power, wanting power, you have to dismiss the love of humanity. And we think that is the exact opposite. In that, and I think that there's enough history that shows us that at the end of the day, if you have power without love, what do you have? What you have is you have a society that does not value human life, that you have a society that is not operating in a way that actually advances humanity. So what's the point? And then if you have it's love and you don't have any power, then at the end of the day, while love in itself has this value that keeps us connected, you want to be able to express that. You want people to have agency so they can express that love for each other. I want families that love each other to be able to feed each other and to have housing and clothing and live comfortably and live a quality of life so they can express the fullness of that love, right, towards each other and towards themselves. And so part of our work and the whole foundation, I would say, of Black Voters Matter, but I will say this is the theme of my entire life. The theme of my entire life, if I don't do anything else in my entire life, if people don't remember me for anything else, right, there are two things that I think are the greatest gifts that humanity has been given, and that there's nothing that we can accomplish, to create, to recreate without using these two things, and that's love and power. That I believe that if we center the value of love for the planet, if we really love the planet, we would have a whole different conversation about climate change, right? If we really, really loved like human beings, there would be an entire different kind of structure around healthcare in this country. And the wealthiest country in the world, we should be saying that we're the healthiest in the world. Why are we the wealthiest and not the healthiest? Because we've actually placed a value on wealth that we're not placing on human life and human wellness. And so if we actually center love, my belief is if we really center the love of how amazing it is, life, is the greatest gift. If we're really centering that, and that becomes our paradigm of which we see how we do our work, I think everything around us would be different.
So we were talking about power and love. And one of the things I've heard you talk about is that your work with Black Voters Matter is partly to show the Black community that they also have power. that they might live in a state where they feel like politics is going against them, but if the voter turnout is there and people will stay engaged, they actually have a lot of power. And I saw a quote where you said, "Blackness isn't a burden, it's a gift." Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I think that growing up in the Deep South and growing in an environment in a nation that has actually utilized it, that racism has been just like a core energy, it's been a core strategy to be surrounded by. There's this and a strong sense of anti-blackness. That this is a nation that, from its inception, was based on the dehumanization of others, and literally there was a strong sense of anti-blackness, that some way Black people were less than human, that in some way Black people's humanity did not matter, didn't count. I mean, this was the first nation. While slavery existed throughout the world, this was the first nation that literally created a whole economic system based on chattel slavery, as if as if Black people were no more than a possession, a cattle, a cow, or other animals. And so, given that, I think part of what is happening, there's a very strong sentiment that we've seen where where Blackness has been attached to something that's negative or something bad or something that we should be ashamed of, or as the burden that we wear. Like it's the political or the economic burden. Because you are Black, you've got to fight harder. Because you're Black, you can't live here. You're Black, you can't do this. You can't be a part of this. And so it's interesting, even in the, sometimes I think in the context of, this is the first Black person, as if the thing itself is the prize, and that the Black person has finally been accepted in this thing, whether it's in a public office, whether it's at a school, as if Black people, the humanity of Black people in itself is less than. And so part of the work around, I think really around power, as I've shared, is that I think our greatest power is our humanity. I believe that, right? And so I think it is the greatest, I think the greatest, most egregious offense you can make to a human being is to try to disconnect or diminish their humanity. And that's what racism does. That's what it has done throughout the world. That's what it has done in this nation. And so I wanted to shift the frame, just as so many people have done before me that gave me space to actually embrace my Blackness, to see Blackness as a blessing, not a burden, that it is a blessing. This is the skin that I wear. This is the experience that I have. This is the offering to the world that I make. It doesn't make me greater nor less than any other human being. And I actually think that I really believe this. I actually believe the liberation of all people. I believe that Black liberation leads to the liberation of all people. I think it's something about seeing people operate in the fullness of who they are and the fullness of their being that gives all of us agency to accept who we are and the magnificence of who we are. So even when as I'm working on Black liberation, I don't believe that it's just for the liberation of Black people. I believe that me centering who I am as a Black person within a context of a racist world, that there is a bit of liberation that is available for all of us.
I've read a lot of great Martin Luther King quotations, but this one was new to me when I did the research for this interview, and it's powerful. He said, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." Also powerful are LaTosha's words about how racism takes away humanity. I'd add that I think this is true not only for the targets of racism, but for the racists themselves, who carry severe emotional burdens made worse by their own bigotry. To kick off our final segment, I asked LaTosha to speak about the work she's doing now to help young girls. You also are spending a lot of time, you mentioned before, running as a woman and some of the sexism you saw on the campaign trail. You've also helped start something called the Southern Black Girls and Women's Consortium, which I'm really interested in. And I've seen, so you have a black bus for Black Voters Matter. I've seen the pink bus. Can you talk about why you chose to spend so much time and energy on Southern Black girls?
Yes. So in 2016, there was a report that came out, I think a couple of years earlier, called the Unequal Lives Report. And in that report, it named how almost $5 billion of philanthropic resources were being invested in states in the South, and less than 1% of those resources were going to Black girls and women. Matter of fact, less than 6% were going to women and girls in general. That is absurd, being that the majority of people in the South are women.
Yeah.
But I saw this report and I was furious. I became furious. And so while I had done a lot of work in the nonprofit sector and in philanthropy, my initial reaction was I was going to go to these foundations and literally lay it out on the line and call the question, like, why are you not doing more? That I wanted them to do more. And I was actually I'm a person of faith, and I was in the shower. And for me, I don't know how other people do it, but for me, whenever I am in the shower, I like get these spiritual downloads or these inspirations or these epiphanies. And as I was in the shower, what I clearly felt and heard in my spirit was that you could do that. You could go around and try to convince people to give more money to this particular area, or you could help lead the way. You could create a
Mhm.
model. And so that's what I did. I was so excited at the moment that I got this kind of revelation that I jumped out the shower. I jumped out the shower and dried off and like literally started writing notes to the point where my paper was wet from my hands writing notes around this vision I had, which was the short version of it was a vision that we would anchor that the Black women and girls could actually create a self-determination model, that we would reverse this trend of not investing in Black women and Black girls by leading the way, by finding resources, by connecting with partners. It's $100 million 10-year initiative. The idea that is in the next 10 years that we would actually generate $100 million, and those resources would be reinvested in Black women and girls. And so we actually have focused on kind of three big core pieces, which I'm excited about. And one of the core pieces is really centered on this idea of that joy is part of our journey. That of
Mhm.
all the things that are happening in our communities, we can talk about the bad stats. We could talk about all these other pieces, right? But what we wanted to do is we want to center a model that was literally around we are going to shift this, and we're going to have fun doing it, and we're going to generate joy, not just for ourselves, but for the world, which is why we have this big old pink beautiful bus with brown girls all around it, as part of our joy is our journey, that as we're on this journey, we're still going to claim and reclaim our girlhood and create joy. The second thing we wanted to do is to make sure that we were building and supporting the capacity building of the ecosystem. That there would
Mhm.
be organizations throughout the South who work in 13 states in the South, all of from North Carolina all the way over to Texas. That we would actually support and build this network, this ecosystem of organizations. And so we funded over 700 organizations so far throughout those 13 states, from West Virginia to Alabama to Mississippi, of organizations specifically that are working with Black girls. And the third thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to shift and create a new model of philanthropy. That at the end of
Mhm.
the day, what we wanted to say is that Black women and Black girls, just as we have served and nurtured and taken care of other people, we can take care of ourselves. And so that part of this process is that every single decision being made from the inception of this idea all the way to the execution, Black women and Black girls have been a part of the process. We have wisdom councils made up of Black women throughout the South that are making the grant making decisions. We've got
Mhm.
sage circles where Black women and girls who have specific kind of ideas, or thoughts or skill sets, are able to transfer those skill sets through trainings and free workshops to other Black women and girls around the area. We have gatherings where we actually, as part of our tour, we have the Black Girl Dream Village, where we literally are creating villages, where one day villages where we have STEM and painting and jewelry making and yoga, and those things that bring us joy. And most recently, we had a partnership. Well, I'm so excited on our last Joys Our Journey tour with mega star, a mega rap superstar, Megan Thee Stallion. And
Yeah.
we were able to do a lot of work around going around having our dream, our Black girl like joy, our joy festivals. But in addition to that, she's very concerned, as we are, around mental health. And so we're launching a whole new grant cycle to support Black girls and women that are doing projects specifically to address mental health in our communities.
So you just mentioned Joy Festival, and this is an audio only podcast. So I'll have to paint a picture because you talk about these incredibly tough challenges with the biggest, broadest smile on your face and sort of bring joy to everything you do. And I want to connect that to, our theme here about optimism and ask you, LaTosha Brown, how, given the challenges you've had in your upbringing, given the challenging issues that you're tackling that are not always the happiest, easiest things, where does your optimism come from? How do you approach it with this incredibly infectious sense of joy? What's that all about for you?
So there's three things that I'll say. The first one is I am a person of faith. I do believe that there is a higher power. I call it God. People call it whatever they want to call it. I call it God, that I know the miraculous nature of life. And I have
Mm,
such a deep appreciation. I think sometimes because it's kind of given, we know how life comes and how it creates, that we take it for granted. I know how incredible it is that every single human being, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, every single human being on this planet is a miracle. Like
mm,
every single one, that even from the point of conception, that, there were a billion sperm and one egg. And I often use this story that I heard someone say years ago, of those billion, hundreds of thousands of them could not even make it. They couldn't find the fallopian tube. And then those that found the fallopian tube, half of them weren't even smart enough to make the whole journey. And then once they got to the egg, then they had to get to the egg, and the egg had enough nerve to say, "Oh, I'm only accepting one." Like, wait. All of us have made this journey, and like it's only, and it doesn't even matter if you're twins. It only accepts one. So at some point, I don't think we understand that when we're looking at every human being, right, at some point was the strongest, was the fastest, was the smartest, and was accepted, right?
mm,
Because the egg has to select it. And so if we really understood how remarkable and amazing that is, we would understand the precious and the amazing, miraculous, just life in itself, the miraculous nature of life in itself. And so part of what gives me the hope and the optimism of doing this work is I'm living in a universe where I'm being told that there are billions and billions of other universes, right?
yeah.
I am living on an earth that's being suspended and is literally centering around with precision around a star that if we just got a mile closer, a mile further away, we would freeze, a mile closer, we would burn up. That kind of precision, right? And we can't figure out something basic like how to treat each other with respect. I think we can. I think it has to be
Mm,
enough of us that are literally calling us to our higher selves and our greater selves. And so I think one of the reasons I think is God, and my optimism comes from this belief, and there's something far more greater that is operating and functioning here. The second piece is just the miraculous nature of human beings. That
yeah.
we've got satellites right now that we're able to have this podcast because somewhere out in space there's some
Yeah.
satellite that is allowing you and I to talk across the country with each other. That's pretty amazing that
Yep.
we have the kind of mental capacity, the kind of acumen that we can actually create and imagine that. And I think the third thing for me around I think that comes in the optimism is quite frankly out of the history of I am a Black woman that lives in the South. I'm so grateful that I am able to move around. I am able to do things that my ancestors never could have imagined. That my presence alone is indicative of what can be done when the human spirit continues to focus on moving forward. That aside from the anti Blackness, aside from this horrible institution called slavery, aside from all of those things that have been done historically with people in my own line, right? I'm still here and I am thriving and I am able to operate in the fullness of my gifts and I'm able to share and I'm able to think even in the midst of everything that's happening. So those things alone, those three things are the reason I don't understand how you can't be optimistic in this space. Like I think optimism is really an indicator of what you focus on, because I think living in a universe, just the idea of astronomy in itself should make us optimistic. The fact that there are billions and billions, not just billions of stars, but there are billions of galaxies that we're not even familiar with. We haven't even tapped into. How could you not be optimistic knowing our existence on this very, very small planet in a very, very immense universe?
You are singing my song, and I really appreciate it. And LaTosha, I can't thank you enough for your time. I know how busy you are. You've been so gracious to spend this time with me. You're just a really inspiring person. And if you want to sing us out, you can. We can end this however you'd like, but I just want to end with a huge thank you for spending this time on the Blue Sky podcast with me today. I really, really thank you.
Thank you. I will just lead by saying this is a moment for us not to give up or feel like we just gotta accept what is. This is really a remarkable moment that optimism is needed. This is a moment that I think that we have to face those things that we have not faced before. I think the some of the racism, some of the political division, all of those things create an opportunity for us. And so if I can say anything else, I'll just leave by saying, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom's land. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. And with that, we are out. Thanks, LaTosha. At this point of the conversation, you're so used to LaTosha's energy and drive that it's not hard to envision her jotting down notes while still wet from the shower. And if there's one motto that's emblematic of her spirit, it's joy in the journey. If you ever see footage of the work LaTosha does, whether it's getting out the vote or working with young girls, she always exudes a hopeful and contagious sense of joy. And that was quite a deep dive into the miracle of life. Not only was LaTosha the first guest to sing on this show, she's also the first to drop a fallopian tube reference on me. She is one of a kind. And of course, it warmed my heart to hear her say near the end, I don't understand how you can't be optimistic. You can probably see now why I'm such a fan of LaTosha Brown and why so many describe her as a force of nature. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, that you'll consider leaving us a rating or review before you go. And while you're at it, consider subscribing to Blue Sky so you won't miss any future episodes. And follow the Optimism Institute on social media if you'd like a break from the doom posts that might be filling your feeds. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.